Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the brand new American premium heavy tank, the T58, in the game of War Thunder. The T58 was in real life part of a family of oscillating turret autoloader vehicles that the United States Army was developing in the early Cold War. While people that know something about tanks might be familiar with designs that entered service for the French military like the AMX-13, the American oscillating turret autoloaders didn't really go anywhere or produce any production variants. However, the T58 does have the distinction of being the largest caliber gun of any of those vehicles. Now, if you're not familiar with why oscillating turrets and autoloaders usually go hand in hand, that's because if the entire turret moves as a single unit, including not just traverse but also elevation, then it's a lot easier to design an auto-loading mechanism because the loader and the barrel basically stay in the same orientation during the entire reload process. That being said, there were two major problems with the oscillating turret concept that ultimately killed them for a lot of countries. The first one was that you couldn't properly seal it from nuclear, biological, or chemical threats, at least not to a level that was deemed acceptable. And additionally, while you could in some degree stabilize them, it was much more difficult to add a stabilizer to these vehicles than it was to a more traditional gun. So despite the fact that there were quite a few different vehicles produced in the American program, at least prototypes, none of them really entered service. That being said, if anybody has the opportunity to make their way to the Armor and Cavalry collection, they actually have surviving examples of two of the oscillating turret autoloaders, the T69 and the T54E1, although the T54E1 has seen better days. They don't have the T58 because, as far as I'm aware, the only surviving T58 was actually destroyed, but you can at least see some of them in person if you have the opportunity to visit the Armor and Cavalry collection like I did. Now, before we get started talking about the T58 itself, I do want to note that one of the oscillating turret autoloaders, the T54E1, is in War Thunder, and it is a premium vehicle, and it is also at about the same battle rating as the T58. So I will be bringing up the little sister of the T58, the T54E1, several times in this video, because I do think it is important to evaluate other potential options, especially when you're talking about a premium vehicle and a brand new one that is not going to be particularly cheap. As one very minor aside before we get started with the T58 itself, I do want to briefly bring up that you will see artillery strikes on my vehicle in the gameplay in the background, and when that first came up I was confused because I thought the T58 was a heavy tank and heavy tanks don't normally get artillery. Well, it turns out they don't get artillery and it wasn't supposed to have it. So if you're looking at the T58 right now, it probably doesn't have artillery because that was removed. So just mentally remove that from the video in the background. So kicking things right off with the mobility aspect of the T58, and the first thing you're going to notice is this is not a particularly mobile tank. It only has a total of 810 horsepower to propel at 60 tons. For reference, the Abrams has roughly double that to propel about the same weight, so it doesn't exactly feel responsive. On top of that, its forward and reverse speeds are only 35 kph forward and 6.3 in reverse, so this reverses about as well as your average Soviet MBT, and that is not a compliment. 35 kph forward, I was gonna say that it's not bad for its battle rating, but for some reason, because this is such an old looking design, I keep forgetting that it's all the way up at 8.3. If this was a 7.3 heavy tank, I think the mobility would be pretty decent, nothing to really laugh at, but because it's all the way up at 8.3 and it consistently fights alongside MBTs, because most tech tree heavy tanks stop at 7.7, you do have a bit of a problem in terms of the mobility of the T58 is pretty underwhelming compared to the average enemy it fights. And of course, combined with a poor power to weight ratio, not only does it have low top speeds, but it doesn't even get up to those top speeds particularly quickly. While the T54E1 does have the same engine, the T54E1 is noticeably lighter at only 54.4 tons and also has a top speed of 43 forward and 8 reverse. So the top speed in reverse is still not particularly good, although 8 is a little more tolerable than 6, but going all the way up to 43 forward, especially when you have a better power to weight, the T54E1 does feel noticeably more nimble. This also brings up the point that the T54E1 always plays like a bit of a cross between a heavy and a medium. It's not quite medium tank versatility and mobility, but it's not quite heavy tank armor. We'll get into that a little bit later. Suffice to say, if you are taking out the T58 expecting the vehicle to tear around the map, you're going to be sorely disappointed. You need to be prepared to pace yourself for some slower gameplay. Now, in terms of protection, the T58 has received a good bit of attention because the T58, according to some people, is pretty well armored, and this is where it gets a little weird. It heavily depends on what types of shell you're fighting firing, and whether you're in a max up tier or a max down tier as to exactly how durable the tank is. And there's also some eccentricities with its damage model that we'll look at in a second that can make it feel more durable than it really is. The first thing to note is that across most of the frontal arc, you can generally expect about 250 to 300 millimeters of protection. This is pretty solid. It's not bad, but it's not exceptional, because the standard penetration when you start looking at a lot of L7 Sabo and L7 Heat FS is around 350. So most L7 Sabo and L7 Heat FS don't have that much difficulty penning it unless you get parts of the collar, because obviously the collar and the turret overlap and you can get effective thicknesses upwards of 800 millimeters if you're punching through the collar. So I would avoid hitting the collar basically altogether, as that will essentially force a non-pen. With that being said, one of the more interesting aspects of the T58 is that the breech of the giant 155 millimeter gun is so large that it basically hides the entire ammo magazine behind it, and also separates the whole turret compartment into basically two separate areas, one with the gunner and commander and another with the loader. So it's actually very difficult to wipe out all three of the turret crew in a single shot, and shots to the front are almost never going to hit the ammo magazine because the breech is completely concealing it. One other feature that shows up pretty quickly when you look at the X-ray is the fact that the turret crew sits really high up on the vehicle compared to the driver, so it's pretty uncommon that hits to the hull get more than maybe one turret crew member, so one-shot hits to the hull, at least in terms of taking out crew, are less likely. That being said, as soon as we do a cutaway from the side and we look at where the ammo is located, now we see one of the Achilles heels of the tank and one of the areas that can be easily exploited if you're fighting against it. The T58 uses two-piece ammo, so you have the powder charge and then you have the shell itself. The powder charges in the hull, which is your spare ammo, is stored directly next to the driver to the right and left of them. They're pretty low to the ground, but they are actually not that difficult to hit. Additionally, if you look at the back of the turret, you have all of the powder charges stored in the back right behind the shells. So what this essentially means is that if you're trying to aim for a one-shot ammo rack, the back of the turret is usually a pretty good shot. You want to aim a little bit further forward so you don't hit the radio, but you do want to aim basically a little bit back from the very back of the turret. Additionally, if you're shooting the hull from the side, shooting right across the driver and all of the powder charges is not the worst shot in the world either. And this also raises another problem that we're going to see with the gun itself when we go into that in a moment, is that the T58 can't really afford to not have this ammo in the hull. It really doesn't have a lot of ammo overall, and it really doesn't have a lot of ammo in the magazine. So you're probably going to most, if not all of the time, see this ammo next to the driver. Additionally, when we look at the front of the vehicle, this is where it starts to get interesting, and part of the reason why I suspect a lot of people think the vehicle is durable from the hull is because they're used to shooting at the center of the vehicle. If you have the driver and the radio operator side by side, you want the round to essentially thread the needle to get both of them with the shrapnel. Additionally, on more modern tanks, you usually want your round to be center mass in terms of the hull in order to basically avoid the fuel tank to the left and right of the driver. However, in the T58, you actually want to favor shots to the left and right because that's where the powder charges for the ammo are. If you just shoot it straight down the middle of the T58, all you get is the driver and engine, which isn't obviously a kill shot, and leaves the T58 fully operational and able to shoot you. In that respect, I do think, much like a lot of other newer vehicles, the T58 does throw people off right now just because the habit they have of trying to shoot center mass on the hull doesn't work as well on this particular vehicle, even if you can pen it. With that being said, one of the most common ways that I died in the T58 was actually hits to the left-hand side of the turret. The forehead on the left-hand side of the turret will often get both the gunner and the commander, and given how massive the gun breech is, also frequently gets the gun breech. So a lot of the L7 Sabo and Heat, and also the Russian 100 and 150 millimeter guns that I was fighting, would simply shoot the left-hand top side of the turret, knock out two crew members, now I can't shoot back, and then would just finish me off. I wouldn't say it happened all the time, but it was a repeatable result, and obviously because the turret is so tall, it's hard to hide that aspect of the vehicle. In fact, your opponent will probably see that if you're cresting a hill before they see the rest of the vehicle. Additionally, if you are stuck in a vehicle that doesn't have the most penetration on something like an APHE round and you're wondering how to deal with it from the front, This little spot right below the gun breech is less than 200 millimeters in terms of effective protection, and if you can land an APHE round right here, it does generally take out the entire turret crew. It's a weird little weak spot that feels kind of video gamey and is hard to hit, but it's not impossible even under combat situations. With all of that being said, I do feel personally that at this moment the reason why the T58s feel so durable is because a lot of people simply aren't used to fighting against them. It's not because they have crazy armor relative to the guns they go up to, so much as people just don't really know where to shoot on this brand new vehicle, which isn't uncommon. However, I do feel that as long as you're moving and as long as you're keeping the turret and hull moving in a way that makes you less predictable or a more difficult target, the T58 does offer a pretty solid level of protection to players that at least attempt to make themselves hard to kill. So overall, I would say the T58's armor is quite good and you can expect good results from it. Now, all of that out of the way, going to the T58's little sister, the T5041, and the big difference that you're going to notice between these two tanks in terms of armor is actually the lower front plate of the T5041, and the fact that the T5041 has its turret lower to the hull, so it's more common to lose turret crew members to penetrating hits to the hull. That in general, I would say, is probably the biggest difference that you're going to notice in terms of overall armor ratings, because a hull down T5041 is often pretty difficult to deal with for the average enemy that fights it. So if you just want a usable armor profile but aren't trying to be invincible, the T5041 certainly offers that. And lastly, moving on to the firepower of the T58, it does obviously, as an American heavy tank, have a 50 cal machine gun on the roof, because of course it does, useful for low-flying planes, helicopter rocket pod rushes, and annoying light vehicles, and also for knocking the tracks off of enemies. Overall a nice feature. It also does feature a rangefinder, and man are you gonna need it because these shells have fairly poor velocity. The fastest moving shell and the one with the flattest trajectory is the heat rounds at over 800 meters per second, but the APHE only has over 600 and the hash is actually sub 600. So these are pretty slow moving shells, and this also explains why when we go into the penetration values in a minute, you're going to notice they seem a little low given the comically large caliber of the gun. So all in all, needless to say, you should probably range find if you get the opportunity to do so. But it turns out if you don't range find, the T58 has a 2.6 second reload, which is incredibly fast. So you can sometimes just afford to expend spotting rounds to just try and get the range without bothering with the rangefinder. I still feel like you're kind of wasting ammo, especially because the tank does not have a lot of ammo. You have a 6-shot revolver magazine for the main gun, and then you only have a spare 14 rounds in reserve after that. So you start with 1 in the chamber, 6 in the magazine, and 14 in the hull. This is 21 rounds total, is not a lot to work with. So while you can technically use the fast reload to essentially fire ranging shots instead of using the rangefinder, I would still definitely recommend trying to range find targets and get one-hit kills where possible. Of course, all of that neatly leads into a discussion of the overall ammo performance, and while the Hesh is a massive Hesh round and actually has pretty good performance, and that performance is bugged right now, I don't personally think the Hesh has that many general applications, especially when we start looking at some of the other ammo types, so as you'll see in the replays in the background, I didn't really use it. The main heat round for the T58, however, has a maximum penetration of just over 400 millimeters, which is enough to deal with most targets. That being said, you are starting to get up there in terms of battle rating, so you are going to find some opponents where this isn't quite enough, but not many of them, and frequently, especially in the max down tiers, the shell can just click on the middle and expect a pen. On top of that, because it is such a massive heat shell, it has a ton of high explosive penetration in terms of being able to overpressure opponents. So not only is the heat round higher velocity than the Hesh round, not only does it have a lot of base penetration compared to the Hesh round, but it also overpressures about as well as the Hesh round, and honestly about as well as most high explosive rounds around this battle rating does, just because it's so big and has so much explosive filler. That being said, I still don't feel, in my humble opinion, the heat is going to be your primary go-to shell. The last shell we're going to talk about is the armor-piercing high explosive, or APHE shell, for the T58. This shell has just shy of 200 millimeters of maximum penetration at a flat angle, and that actually sounds pretty weak compared to some of the lower BR shells and their penetration. The American Long 90 and the German Long 88 can comfortably hit in the 230s, so both of those penetrate more armor than this. But that being said, that alone is not actually telling you the full story. The angled performance of this shell is completely bonkers just because of how utterly massive it is. It will slice through thin plates very easily, even at remarkably sharp angles. Another interesting factor to consider is that this shell has a lot of explosive mass. The German Long 88 that everybody will be familiar with Tiger II, has 64 grams of explosive filler. The APHE on the T58 has 653, so over 10 times the explosive filler. It's like a small bomb going off in the enemy tank. So as long as something goofy doesn't happen, like you fire it directly into the engine block or into a fuel tank, it should comfortably wipe out the entire interior of the enemy vehicle with essentially no issues, making it a very consistent one-shot. And that one-shot potential, combined with the incredibly ridiculous angled performance, is why, in my opinion, this is the better shell in the majority of situations. This also wraps back around to what we were just discussing in terms of the overall ammo capacity, and that is the T58 simply doesn't have a lot of it. So if you are having a really good game and you're on a nuke, the heat rounds are going to run out faster than the APHE rounds, because no matter how powerful a heat round is, it's still stuck doing damage in a fairly finite cone, whereas the APHE rounds potentially one-shot very easily with every penetrating hit as long as you land a pretty good one. With that being said, the ammo loading for the T58 does get a little awkward at that point, because 200 millimeters of penetration doesn't cut it against every enemy you're going to fight at 8.3. So while I do prefer the APHE rounds in the vast majority of cases, you are definitely going to have to take some of the heat rounds. But the good news is, with a 2.6 second reload, switching ammo is relatively fast and easy. If you're wondering, my personal ammo loading for the T58 was 15 rounds of APHE and 6 rounds of heat. Overall, I would say the T58's gun is very over the top in terms of both how insanely fast it reloads and how insanely big the shells are. But once you get past that, the low velocity, the limited ammo capacity, and also the various performances of the shell, with the APHEs having incredible damage but low pen and the heat having incredible pen but low damage, does force a little bit of juggling on the player's part and a little bit of a decision making on your part. For less experienced players that don't necessarily know when to switch between shell types, taking nothing but heat rounds might actually be the best decision, but if you are a skilled player and you generally know what you can get away with, the APHE rounds can offer you some truly amazing games. However, all of that being said, I do feel now is a great time to bring up the T58's little sister yet again, the T54E1. The T54E1 has an APDS round that pens over 400 millimeters and has enough mass that it actually does produce pretty consistently good spalling, and also has significantly higher velocity than anything on the T58. So for the T54E1 that also has a rangefinder, the shells are easier to aim, you don't have to worry as much about switching between shell types. The penetration, especially for a kinetic round, is so high that a lot of times it'll even go through early ERA pretty efficiently. However, this comes at the cost of the reload going all the way up to 5 seconds instead of 2.6 seconds. So while I do feel the T54E1 does have a much more user-friendly gun than the T58, the T58's gun is pretty meme-worthy, especially given how rapidly you can fire it. So working our way towards the conclusions, I'm going to give some closing thoughts on the T54E1 and then go straight into the T58 Heavy. The T54E1 is an older GE vehicle. It goes on sale reasonably often. It's at a slightly lower battle rating, so its up tiers aren't quite as harsh. The gun is pretty easy to use, the armor is very workable, and the mobility is not bad. If you want a playstyle that's at least somewhat comparable to a T58 but at a much lower price point, especially when it's on sale, I don't think this is the worst buy in the world, and I've had good success with it. I feel like the vehicle is incredibly underrated just because it is an older GE vehicle, and those often get overlooked by the player player base even when some of them are quite good. So considering the fact that the T58 probably won't be going on sale anytime soon, and we do have the holiday sales coming up where the T5041 is probably going to be at around half off, it is at least worth considering. And going back to the T58, the reason why heavy tanks don't often end up above 7.7 is largely because if you go much above 7.7, you'll find a lot of scenarios where your armor feels almost completely useless. And the T58 is not completely immune to that. It does have a decent internal layout to go with the armor profile, and you will run into enemies in a max down tier that can't really hurt you, but you'll also run into enemies in a max up tier that will have absolutely no problem going through basically any part of your armor that matters. But this is one of those areas where the T58 Heavy does have something else to offer. The T58 Heavy does have the incredibly powerful gun with the incredibly fast reload. And this is one of those important factors where if the main factor of a tank doesn't work, you start asking what secondary factors does it have that might also work. And when your armor doesn't quite work, being able to fall back on beating the hell out of the enemy by just hitting them repeatedly with your fast firing, insanely powerful gun is certainly an effective strategy. I will also say, and this is a very subjective aspect of this review, that while the low velocity of the shells does make them annoying to use at certain ranges, it does actually help to sell the size and the weight of the shells, especially with the recoiling animation and the gun audio. It really makes it feel like instead of firing a tank cannon at another tank, you're throwing a rock at somebody's face. And in keeping with that, landing those hits on moving targets at longer ranges with these lower velocity shells feels incredibly satisfying, like successfully leading an enemy's face in a game of dodgeball. Honestly, given how mobile most of your enemies are and how ponderous and heavy this tank is, it feels less like you're in a PvP mode and more like you're playing the big bad in a PvE mode, going around as a giant ogre smashing anybody that gets near you with overwhelming and ridiculous force. It's a pretty entertaining vehicle to play even when it's not being the most effective. Certainly while I was playing it, the higher functioning part of my brain is fixating on how the T5041's Sabo is much higher muzzle velocity, has good penetration while also having good damage, etc, etc. But whenever I killed somebody with the T58's gun, the monkey part of my brain would laugh like it had just smashed a bug with a rock. The T58, in my humble opinion, is a unique combination of a vehicle that is both fun and effective, at least if you're interested in the playstyle. However, this is where I get to the awkward part, because this vehicle is very dangerously close to me recommending it even when it's at full price, which is exceedingly rare for this channel. But one big thing to be wary of about this vehicle is the max up tiers. 9.3 is a very unkind matchmaker to a heavy tank because you can run into vehicles that have stabilizers, darts, laser rangefinders, and thermal imaging, and while you can take out these vehicles, it's not impossible. You really shouldn't be winning those fights unless your opponent makes a mistake, especially against vehicles like the M60 TTS, the Leopard 1A5, or the T72A. All of these vehicles really have the advantage on you because their guns are more responsive and they can basically snap to wherever they want on your tank and eliminate it at any range and any distance. And this also means the T58 requires you to play it somewhat differently depending on whether you're in a max down tier or a max up tier. In a max down tier, you can sit at long ranges and a lot of opponents will really struggle with you. In a max up tier, you have to avoid those long range encounters like the plague because you're going to be at an inherent disadvantage that will be incredibly difficult to overcome. So while I find the T58 is on the cusp of being universally good, it does come with a small asterisk in that it is a very high battle rating for a heavy tank. But those are just my thoughts on the matter. What do you think about the T58? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you hate playing against it because they are pretty popular right now? Let me know in the comments down below. I always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, you found it educational, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.